Welcome to Wigtown Book Festival. Thank you for joining us in these strange times. My name is Hannah Lavery, and before we start, I would just like to say a huge thank you to the team behind Wigtown Festival for doing everything to make this a really easy event to attend and to chair. So we are here today to have what many might say is a discussion with a particular relevance to this year. But others, and myself included, would say that this is a well overdue discussion about Scotland, race and empire. Scotland and its relationship to and its acknowledgement of its colonial history and its involvement in the transatlantic slavery is often a history we ignore and hide from. But it has huge ramifications today about how we relate to one another. And we are really fortunate today to have three wonderful thinkers to help us unpack and to discuss and explore some of that together. So we have today Sir Geoff Palmer, Lisa Williams, and Thulani Rachia. Sir Geoff Palmer is a Professor Emeritus at the School of Life Sciences at the Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh and a human rights activist. Lisa Williams is the director of the Edinburgh Caribbean Association. She runs Black walking tours of Edinburgh and educational workshops in Scottish schools. Thulani Rachia, who is beaming from Johannesburg today, so we're hoping that the technology will stay good for us, is an artist, teacher and curator based in Glasgow. Growing up in South Africa, his art practice integrates the fields of architecture, performing and visual arts. So welcome, and I hope you're all well. So I think we'll just get, actually before we start with the questions, I'll just go quickly over the format today. Because of some technical hitches, we won't be able to kind of have live questions. We may have a few questions that come through from sort of Facebook and things that we'll try and talk about and have time for at the end. But basically what we'll do is I'm going to pose a few questions to the panel and we will take it in turns to answer those questions. And then again, as I say, if we manage to get a few questions coming through, we will look at those before the end. So really, it's just, we'll jump in with the first question, which I suppose I've been thinking about the question that was posed in the event description. And what I would like you to maybe think about and to talk about is, what would this coming to terms with our colonial history look like to you? And maybe we'll start with Lisa.
Okay, thank you, Hannah, for the introduction and the welcome. I'm really pleased to be here with everyone this evening. This year's been very, very emotional for so many of us. I think what I wish for is that we could have a more mature discussion than sometimes we're able to have. I think this year's been unlike any other year. I think a lot of people were not prepared for it, who maybe are new to these discussions and are feeling a bit bewildered by it as well. But what I wish is for us to move on from maybe ideas of pride, shame, guilt, or if we're feeling those emotions, to recognize them and be able to integrate them into our discussion in a way that's really positive. And I think it's not until we can get to that stage can we really have a very constructive and positive conversation with one another. And I do think, there's so many things, Hannah. There are so many different things that we could think about. One of the things that bothers me is sometimes people don't see the importance of understanding this history and say, oh, it's the past, why is that important? And not understanding the legacies that come from that period that people are still living with today. And I think if people can really get to grips with that, that will be a very helpful discussion, which doesn't lead to further hurt and pain of people who are still suffering very much from the legacy of that period.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think, well, thank you, Lisa, so much. I think it'd be really interesting to return to what that legacy is as we further into our conversation. Turning to Sir Geoff, again, that this, we're often talked about coming to terms with something. I'm interested in what coming to terms looks like for you. What does that mean? So yeah, so I'll open the floor to you, Sir Geoff.
Okay, thank you. I think what we have, is ignorance, in a sense that you can't expect people to respond to what they don't know or know well. And I think what we have is a situation where, when I've given lectures up and down Scotland on this history, the consistent response has been, why hasn't anybody told us this before? And therefore, we have a large population. In fact, the details of our history is sometimes not even known to Black people, basically because it wasn't taught. When I was brought up in Jamaica, I was never taught any of it. I was living in a very poor area, and you went to school and church. And thus you had no idea or anything about slavery. I knew one white person when I lived in Jamaica, and that's the minister of my church. So I had to learn my history myself. I had to teach myself. And therefore, what I then recognized that in the white population, say in Scotland, it has been the fault of the education system, not the people. And therefore, what we now have to address is a situation where the curriculum, it doesn't have this history. When it's there, it's what they call nice to do. And therefore, as what Lisa just said, some people say it's the past, because that's the excuse they give, because that's all they can give. It's, oh, that's the past, so why bother? And what I say there, the past has consequences. And therefore, what we've got to try now is to do a bit about the history, but also to try, and that's the education side, but we also have the social side of addressing some of the consequences of this history. And one of them is obviously racism, which is linked to that slavery.
And we'll come back to that. I think the kind of follow-up question that we'll, after we've spoken to Thulani, is really about that consequences. So Thulani, again, just kind of posing that question to you again, what would coming to terms with our colonial history look like to you?
Gosh, it is such a big question, as Lisa was saying. I think for me, it's about trying to grapple with and understand the legacy, how this history, which is not known by anybody, it's known by a sort of minority, has led to such inequality, inequality in representation. And, I always sort of think about this example. If you're thinking about a young person who attends school, and we think about sort of their day and what they interact with, So they wake up, they may listen to the news or listen to radio. We ask who is the presenter or who's presenting the news that they're presented with, On their way to school, they might walk through the city, might be driven through the city, and they see, monuments and architecture, who is being memorialized in these monuments and architectures, Once they get to school, they are taught who is teaching them and what are they being taught, So just in that example of what a young person interacts with and what they come into contact with, so many different industries are implicated. We have media, we have the educational system, and we have the built environment, So these are all different sectors that are perpetuating this inequality, an idea of representation. So for me, it's about actually thinking about how all sectors are implicated in this conversation and all need to contribute to making a change. It's not just about thinking about, the built environment or the educational system. It's all industries that are implicated and need to be actually be a part of this conversation and implementing some sort of change.
Mm. Well, that really leads into the kind of question that I really wanted to pose following up from that, which is the idea about what are the consequences, because we, as Sir Geoff was just saying, the idea that this history is past, it's over. I feel that a lot of the when you bring this up, there's a lot of the kind of common response, Lisa, for example, you know, and I've spoken to Lisa about this before, is this is just over. What are you doing talking about this now? We've done this, we should move on, blah, blah. So I really wanted to ask you about what are the consequences you think today of that erasure? Should we keep, I'm kind of conscious we should change.
Some work in schools, and I do some Black history work in schools. Sometimes I link the two things. Now, one of the secondary schools I've been looking at, I've been asking teachers to fill in a survey about their confidence levels to do with tackling racism, to do with an understanding of Black history, whether involved in Black History Month. This one particular school has never celebrated Black History Month. And when the few teachers that have chosen African-American figures, there are no Scottish, not even Black British people ever chosen, which is a terrible shame. So you have an issue in a school where it's, you know, a particularly multicultural school where some Black children are feeling particularly alienated, and they're really not seeing the teachers, for as far as I can see, the teachers are not, and you can see this in a lot of schools, the teachers are not making that connection with the representation, with actually discussing this history in a positive way or even in a thorough way. And also how you order the kind of history that you teach, you know, what kind of images you use in the classroom as well. Not making the connections with these very strong psychic effects on children, because there's children of all kinds of different backgrounds, and what kinds of effects happen then as a result of your lack of teaching, or the way that you teach it in a way that isn't done sensitively, which then goes on to aggravate an already difficult situation in school where children don't feel supported, they don't feel respected, and it spirals out of control because those young people are not listened to. So even if we're just looking at the issues of racism that go on in schools in Scotland, which actually are really at an alarming level, as a lot of us have spoken about, and not making those connections with dealing with the past in a good way, I think it leads to a lack of empathy and lack of understanding, because I think there's so much denial around racism, and actually listening to the lived experiences of people is often just, not regarded, not taken seriously, gaslighted, if you want to use that term. And I think a lot of our young people are really suffering. And I also think that we do a real disservice to children, white children, and all children really, to not have an understanding of how the country came about in the way that it did. So therefore, even if you're looking at things like understanding politics, international relations, looking at economics, looking at the development of your country and how the infrastructure of your country came about, if you don't even understand those things, that even the linen industry could not have developed in Scotland in the way that it did if it didn't have a ready market to clothe enslaved people on plantations in places like Virginia and Jamaica. And a huge percentage, you're talking about 80% at some point of export. So even if you don't understand those basic things, you're not even understanding how your own country came about, and let alone making sure that we are living in a society where everyone is respected. So there are these huge gaps that just lead to all sorts of terrible things where this year, the kinds of conversations which are, maybe people who haven't been in these conversations before are really quite genuinely shocked by it, because we live in, I would say, for example, Edinburgh, I consider to be quite a segregated city in terms of class, in terms of race. There are people really living in silos where they're not having conversations with other people. So I think if we could get to a situation where people can listen respectfully to one another and understand this history, so that you can have real empathy for people and just listen and learn and understand. And I think this year we have seen so many more people come on board, which I feel, give thanks for. That although we're living through some tragedy and some very, very worrying times as well, that we have the other side of it, where a lot more people are coming on board and genuinely wanting to learn and listen and do better, which is fantastic.
Well, thank you.
A very long answer, but yeah.
Oh, great answer. So much in there. Should we, Thulani, I saw you nodding a lot, so go Thulani, then Sir Geoff. So Thulani.
No, I was just, resonating with a lot of what Lisa was saying, especially when you were referring to sort of, what do young people come into contact with at school? And I think I also refer to young people a lot because I work with a lot of young people. And just when you were talking there, Lisa, I was thinking about a project that I did. I co-directed a project at the National Museum of Scotland, working with young people. One of them actually was Lisa's son. And that project was sort of looking at how we can use performance, sound and writing to think about how we can sort of insert alternative narratives in the museum setting. So we were meeting with the young people regularly. And I think it was in the second meeting, we sort of took a tour around the museum, and we came back to our meeting room, and one of the young people said or asked, why is it that sort of the African section in the museum, with the African cultures, the way that those cultures are depicted is sort of primitive, and they describe them as being frozen in time, right? And you walk around the museum and all the European cultures are sort of, they show them as, primitive, but also developed, how they've developed over time and the discoveries they've made and all these sorts of things. So it was such a massive question in that process, because it felt like it really captured what was wrong with how these histories are told and how people are represented in these spaces that are supposed to be educational spaces, right? But we ask, okay, what is this education, And actually, funnily enough, the young kids actually started asking, who are the people that choose what is, what's chosen, what's prioritized, who writes these texts in these spaces, And it just felt like it was a microcosm for such a massive, a bigger question. But again, it feels like, that's now a remnant, of this history that hasn't been dealt with in the correct way, and it feels like it perpetuates these narratives.
Well, thank you.
So yeah, that's just, I guess, one example.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to ask Geoff to respond to the question about consequences. But I'm really interested in what you were saying about this idea that it's about who's in charge of the narrative and who's in charge of the story that we tell of ourselves. And I had the absolute really kind of life-changing moment of seeing Sir Geoff talk about Scotland and its history, particularly with slavery, at an event in Dunbar a couple of years ago, if you remember, Geoff. And I remember feeling that there was a real strength in the storytelling. So just as a comment, but really, again, just to you, the idea, the consequences of not talking this history, not having that as part of our narrative. What would you say?
Well, yes, thank you. In that, what I feel is that we, as just been said, that if you go to a museum and you see how the African culture is depicted, and you look at, say, European culture, this is exactly what Hume did. Because what he did, he actually got up one morning and he thought, well, we've got a house, with the 3 bedrooms and a roof and stuff. And you look at Africa, they've got a a sort of like a hut with a straw. And therefore, if you look at it in that way, in terms of cognitive intelligence, that's what it looks like. But then, what I usually say to people, Hume couldn't survive 2 weeks in Africa because there are more to how people live in terms of the complexity than to do with the size and the shape of a house. And that's what is not taught. That in fact, the way people live, the very fact they're alive, tells you they're successful. That's a biological concept. As long as you're alive and somebody else is, you are as successful as he or she is biologically. The problem is, in the circumstances you're living, your life will probably be shorter, or it will be more miserable. And what we're going to try and do, or what we hope to do, is to point out that to people. So to look at a Black person and then relate it superficially to a visual comparison is nonsense. What we have to do is to compare it with the complexity of survival. And therefore, what you have now is, if we then look at the consequences of slavery, we have white academics are still teaching, that white people abolish slavery because Black people, they got sorry for Black people, and thus they abolish it. It is not true. Thus, we have to start changing the way it's taught, because it is still being taught, as Hume said it, where the white person is actually making decisions for Black people because they haven't got the capacity. And during the 60s, when I was a boy in London, we had a Professor, I think, and it was at a time when there was to prove that Black people are less intelligent. So what the white society has been trying to do is to find a justification, a scientific one, to actually substantiate the prejudices of the past. So to say that Black people were inferior, you then have to find some scientific justification for it. And therefore, there were all these intelligence tests trying to find that Black people were less intelligent than white people. It didn't work because scientifically you can't compare two people on that basis. What I've often said, the only way you can get a control for a white person, for a Black person, is put them through 300 years of slavery. That's the control. And if you can't do that, then that comparison is irrelevant. Therefore, what we've got to try and do is to look at the way Black people have been treated for, say, 300 years, look at the attitudes that it has produced in white people, like the teachers Lisa was talking about, because they have it in their subconscious that Black people are inferior. That hasn't been removed. So we now need an educational system to change that mindset. People smile and laugh, but they think it. And one politician proved it in the 60s, because you know what he said? How would you like your little blonde daughter to bring home a big Black guy? And he won his seat. Because all the prejudices about race, he summarized it, because that is what people really think. So these are the consequences. The consequences in attitudes, the consequences in how people see each other, consequences of you can't trust a Black person as a police because, you're going to go to bed if the country is being run by Black people. And therefore, we've got to change those prejudices from the past. And we've got to do it through education. And we've got to do it through work in the community. which, things like what Lisa is doing, but we also have to do it in schools. And the point is that we've got to point out to people that you've been given an attitude about us that is not true. And therefore, that has to change. And I think once we can do that, we can remove one of the most awful consequences of our slavery, where people still believe that we were enslaved because we were subhuman. And therefore, in fact, it is not acceptable that we should share the same space with them. And that must change. And we can change that through education and also other means of how we change attitudes in this society.
Mm. And it's interesting because what you're saying connects back to what Thulani was saying about representation. And I think sometimes that idea that and it's not just about feeling good about yourself. I mean, we're talking about stereotypes which, that end with murders like the murder of George Floyd. I mean, these stereotypes are incredibly dangerous if they are allowed to fester and to be promoted. So I think what you're saying is incredibly important about the consequences of looking at where these, following back where these ideas come from and about that responsibility. Thank you so much for sharing that. I suppose we're kind of coming to this idea, since we're talking about representation, and we're connecting back to Thulani's walk through Glasgow. There has been a lot of discussion this year. And again, as I was saying, when I first started, these discussions have been going on for a long time. So none of these are new. And I know, for example, Geoff, you've been talking about this for a long time. But I suppose the question is, what do we do with these statues? What do we do with these street names and university towers? And what do we do? And what is the... Yeah, no, let's just go with that. What do we do? And should we start? I think maybe I'll go with Thulani first. And I will go with that. What should we do with them all? I don't, Thulani, if you unmute, yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, Hannah, before we can even move on to what we need to do, I think there needs to be an understanding of the effect that, architecture, space, monuments have on our psyche as people, So architecture obviously has a role in creating an idea, perpetuating an ideology and beliefs about culture. And so I think there needs to be really clear understanding about that first, and how, as a people, we sort of understand ourselves in relationship to these architectures, right? So, for example, if I'm out in the street and I see these monuments, but I don't see anyone who looks like me memorialized, what is that effect? What effect does that have on my psyche and my understanding of the world, my confidence? There's also something about who is welcomed. If I don't see people who look like me in these public spaces, am I going to feel welcomed? Do I feel like I'm a part of the city and these spaces? So there's something about then, who are these spaces really for? And how can architecture and these monuments actually hold the ideals that we're actually wanting to implement in the city and in these conversations? So yeah, for me, it's really about trying to understand the effects of space and architecture before we can actually move on to what do we do? Because I think that people dismiss this conversation around monuments, around repurposing these monuments, or, this idea of representation also being extended in monuments. People dismiss that because they don't actually understand how it affects people. They don't understand how it affects how people think about themselves in the world. Again, if we're thinking about young people, when they see these statues, if they don't see themselves represented, that really diminishes their idea of what they think they can achieve, what they think is possible for their lives and their existences, you know? So, yeah, I think for me, it's really about thinking about first what effect.
Yeah, the harm it's done. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. No, that's really interesting. I think this feels like going to Geoff now would be a really good moment, because I know that you've talked and I've spoken really eloquently about what, for example, with Henry Dundas, haven't you? And so
yes.
let's just open the floor to you to talk about this as well.
Well, thank you very much. When all this started, you know, with and I knew that in Bristol they were looking at that statue for years in terms of changing the plaque and to produce a narrative that reflected, you know, the bad things he did in slavery. And it took them quite a long time. And I was being interviewed by a reporter from Bristol recently. And you know, she said, yeah, you know, we got the statue down. And I said, what's been the response of the people who were writing the narrative for that plaque? And she said, you know, nobody's ever asked that because they seem relieved. The point is that that's it in a nutshell. The fact is the powers that be on the system doesn't want the truth on a plaque. They'd rather the statue down. Therefore, we've got to be very careful of that. That somehow, therefore, if I relate it to our situation in Edinburgh, where, you know, we spent 3 years trying to work out a new narrative for that statue, which started 199 years ago. And in all that time, we've never had the word slavery on that plaque. When one considers that this is the man that delayed the abolition of the slave trade for 15 years, causing over 600,000 African people to be transported into slavery. And it is George Floyd's death and the interest in this history that actually caused the council to actually reconstitute a committee to look at it again. And a narrative was produced in 5 days. Took us 3 years for nothing. So what we have is this resistance to the truth on the plaque. And therefore, we're the same with Hume and Hume Tower. The point is that putting on the plaque that he was the guy who said black people are inferior to white people and they were like parrots if they could show any talent, and that they were in many ways similar to apes. The point is that those concepts are still in certain people's subconscious because culture is passed on. It doesn't stop. The way what we believe and how we think are passed on. They're like genes. And therefore, the only way we can change that is to, not only through education, but to show people that Henry Dundas or Hume or anybody, what they did must be put on that plaque so people can see it and come to terms as to why, what we suffered. Because somebody reading that plaque saying that he did that will produce a different perception of us without him having to go to school, without having to go to a lecture. It'll be there permanently for 200 years.
Yeah.
And that is where the resistance is. And my battle with the Viscount, the present Viscount, it's about that. He doesn't want that on his ancestors' plaque. He'd rather the statue down. And my attitude is that I don't want it down. I want that slavery on that plaque because that's the truth. And therefore, we are today the past of the future. We are creating, and the way we live, a manner that people are going to look back in 100 years and see what we've done and say, why did they do it? And I don't want historians to tell me, oh, that is how they behaved in the past, so we can forget it. Don't use your politically correct attitudes today to judge the past. That's what one historian said recently. The point is that people have got to get used to the idea, if you do bad things, they will haunt you forever. It'll stop people behaving badly, thinking it's the past, you can forget it. And you can hurt people and it's okay. The fact is that Hume said that we're a different species. That's significant. Because you know what that means? That means our children cannot produce children. It's like we're comparing a dog and a cat. That's how we were being compared to white people. The point is that that removes the prospects of mixed race people. So the only people he was saying who exist in the world are going to be pure white and pure black. That's what he was saying. And that is completely unforgivable. And therefore, it must be stated. And I don't want it to be fudged with other intellectual ideas, because that's what's affecting us. The subconscious, that we are something that we're not. Yeah. All human beings are interfertile and their children are perfectly fertile.
Thank you.
And therefore, that's why they changed it to race. Because race, you take out the humanity of fertility. And the point is that what I want with those statues and the buildings and whatever, to put that narrative on it. And I've often said, I know what's being said, you know, that emotionally it can be upsetting to see these things. Maybe I don't have the same emotions. To me, they're just stones and piece of metal. My ancestors faced real slave owners. And you're telling me I can't face a stone or a bit of metal. The point is that what I see is an object there that represents the past which my ancestors had to put up with. And therefore, I want the public to know it.
Yeah.
I don't want to go to a museum to see it. It has a context. Yeah. Dundas is there because they put it there for a reason. If you move it, you remove the historical context, and therefore it is pointless. And if you remove the evidence, you remove the deed. So I want a plaque.
Yeah.
You remove the evidence, you remove the deed.
Thank you.
And therefore, let it stay, put a plaque on it, because that's going to be part of the education of not only people in Scotland, but every visitor that visits will see that. Because that's how we're going to change this attitude that we are inferior in some other species. We're not. We're one humanity. And the world has got to come to terms with that.
Thank you. Lisa, Lisa's work, just to remind people, she does these incredible walking tours of Edinburgh, Black History walking tours. And I think I've still to go on one because the weather, I've never quite managed to get there, but I will do. And I think so a lot of your work is about this, about the narrative and about, so I really want to hear what you've got to say about what we do about these statues and these monuments.
Well, I haven't got the definitive answer, but Sir Geoff was a massive inspiration to me as well. Going to one of his lectures a few years ago, and you know, knowing a lot of Caribbean history and knowing a lot of British Black history, and blew me away, and that really encouraged me to research a lot more. Talking of David Hume, when we go past the David Hume statue, there's always a bagpipe, so we kind of move across to Parliament House and we talk about some of the important legal cases like the Joseph Knight case. But especially when I'm working with young people, so let's say we've got 13-year-olds, for example, and I love working with that age group because they ask you good questions and they're not afraid. So let's say 12, 13, we talk about Hume. I tell them about a Ghanaian Enlightenment philosopher called Anton Wilhelm Amo, who went to Germany and becomes this very distinguished Enlightenment philosopher just a little bit before Hume. It's kind of surprising that Hume didn't know about him, and I would imagine Hume knew an awful lot. He disparages Francis Williams, who comes from Jamaica, and he, like Sir Geoff was saying, just talks plainly like a parrot. So whatever he did know about Black intellectuals in Europe would not have fitted his paradigm and have find a way of throwing that out again. So when we talk about Hume, I've mentioned just as someone who was in a very similar position, but he goes back to Ghana and he goes back to some of his traditional arts, and he becomes a very well-respected diviner using astronomy and astrology, but also his philosophy that he's learned in Europe. So it's this combination that's really interesting. I talk about a lot of, and Sir Geoff was making a very good point as well. You might people are trained here to look at certain African peoples being primitive or whatever, the kinds of things you see on the media. My kids would laugh about it. Come from the Caribbean, everyone's Black, everyone's in powerful positions, and you come here and then you're seeing these constant adverts of people just the media was a real shock to them how Black people represented in Britain. It was a whole new world. But thinking of things like, people who maybe look simple from the outside but have got extremely complex spirituality and communal bonds and all sorts of things going on, but also huge civilizations like Great Zimbabwe. And I mentioned to the kids, I said, do you know about Great Zimbabwe trading with China centuries ago? Do you know about the universities of Timbuktu, which were operating in Mali centuries before St. Andrews? So make sure they know about those things so they can see for themselves what Hume is saying is a nonsense, and even at the time, I make sure to explain that even other Enlightenment scholars like James Beattie was saying, Hume, you're talking nonsense, and made him revise his footnote in 1770 and start to change it. But he still kept in this idea of Negroes. That was too hard for him to remove. But he knew he was talking nonsense. And then looking at other Black intellectuals who come along in the decades after in Edinburgh University and also say, Hume, you're talking nonsense, and make sure that those people's work are respected, that it's not a new thing that we're suddenly saying, because we're suddenly really enlightened now that we can see this as nonsense, even at the time. And the other thing I also try to encourage people to see is multiracial movements, especially multiracial working class movements, but also middle class movements as well, where you have very real solidarity going on with the Edinburgh Ladies Emancipation Society, who are helping Black female abolitionists in America and really putting abolition before their own needs in terms of female suffrage, which is really rare and not like it happens in America. And making sure that people know that people have been fighting for this since day dot. And they've been fighting on the continent, fighting on the ships, taking over ships. They found that if there were more women on board, there tended to be more revolts on ships. Talking about all the freedom fighters in the Caribbean, saying, well, you all have your so-called heroes here. And then in the Caribbean, you will also have people like Kwame Gladstone fighting on one of Gladstone's plantations for freedom. Those people are also honoured. And the fact this conversation is also happening in the Caribbean right now as well, saying, should we really be commemorating people who enslaved us, who, committed genocide in our own countries? Even so that kind of conversation is really interesting. Statues, I think there are many things we could do. I totally understand to Geoff's point. I think sometimes people don't, like going down the line, people are a bit lazy sometimes to read plaques. I think but that's a really important thing, the fact that it's still there and people are confronted with these things in that way. I think there's many things we could do. I understand Thulani's point as well. We have to maybe spend a bit more time, not let it drag on forever when nothing happens and you end up with this stalemate where you're ignored, like happened in Bristol. We don't want that to happen. To maybe set a period of time. So, 2-3 years time, we're going to make sure that we get Sir Geoff's been trying, his hardest to educate people, and totally respect him for that, for years in this city. And I'm trying to sort of pick up the baton and do what I can now as well. But to really get to a point now where people are listening much more and make sure people really understand this history, make it very accessible to them. Sometimes I'm surprised that we've had Google for a long time now, that people aren't curious to go and search for themselves rather than say, well, why did no one tell us? Well, you've got Google. You can go and look. You can go find something. You might not have the same kind of accessibility as an academic. And I think that's sometimes an issue as well. Academics tend to be often in their ivory tower. There isn't always that kind of openness to community. Those conversations are sometimes closed. And I think that can create a problem as well. But I think there's many different things we could do. The Melville Monument to me is so high. I took a Caribbean artist around a couple of weeks ago, and the first thing he said was, whoa, that's like disproportionately high, really unusually. And I talk about how it was originally going to be on a pyramid on top of Arthur's Seat. That was the plan, sort of immortalization of Melville, right? So I think we can take it on a case-by-case basis, but I think in order to have mature discussions around it, we do still need a bit of time for people to, understand the psychic effect, understand the history, understand what was going on in places that you don't even see now or see the effects of now. If you're in the Caribbean, you're seeing people dying of things they shouldn't be dying from. And you can say this about the African continent, you can say about places in Asia as well, where Europe is still benefiting from a system that is based on those colonial times. And people don't really genuinely to understand, because the Caribbean is advertised as this paradise. It was actually Scottish people from Dundee, it was photographers after the Morant Bay Rebellion and the massacre that happened after that. They wanted to sort of reinvent Jamaica as this wonderful paradise for Europeans to go to. And I think we're still living with that. We've got these tourist brochures that look all very fancy and fantastic, and it doesn't show. People don't understand the kind of levels of poverty that people have to live with as a direct result of this period.
Thank you so much. And I think you, when you were talking, I was thinking very much about the fact that it's just the not even knowing Scotland's relationship to Jamaica and just about the kind of, as Geoff was talking about earlier, that ignorance, just the and what I can see the fear about the monument going and the history going with it, and actually to have that stuff spoken, that story spoken, how important that can be. We've got a couple of questions that have come through from audience members. Before we go to them, because then I think we're starting to run out of time, we've got about another 10 minutes or so left. I just wanted to ask something that's been really, I've been thinking a lot about the kind of emotional labour that was asked of people of colour around George Floyd's murder, and around these conversations generally, and about, I suppose, just asking you kind of what the cost of this work is to you, and what support you feel that you need from wider society to carry on this work, whether that is within, well, actually, I'll let you answer yourself. So, Thulani, to bring you back into the conversation, what is the cost of doing this work, and as to an individual, what is needed to support this work?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think we all understand the difficulty in having these conversations when sort of people who are pushing back are not actually willing to do any of the work, As Lisa was saying, so much of this information can be found on the internet, can be Googled in a few seconds, but it's usually people of color who are the ones that are having to have these conversations continuously. And I think just for me, I think from understanding the pushback that we went through as a country here in South Africa with the Rhodes Must Fall movement, when those conversations were coming up, and there was a massive pushback by, predominantly white people, and the conversation was around them talking about, no, we can't erase this history. They identify with that history. This history represents me, and for me, I became, I started asking, well, how, firstly, there's a problem there, because what happens if what you are identifying with and what you are saying represents you is actually what is oppressive to someone else? That for me, there's a real big problem there. So for me, actually, for now, it's actually, I push back. And for me, it's about actually asking those people to do the work and really understand how it is that you are identifying with something that is actually, ultimately oppressing someone else, So it's for them to do the work, actually. I disengage with sort of doing that sort of labor. However, I do feel now that I'm able to sort of have conversations sort of even in my workspace around sort of boundaries and sort of setting almost work for my colleagues to do, like I'm not necessarily going to engage with in these conversations unless you have done a certain amount of work. I'm not going to engage in conversations around diversity and representation in this workplace unless you have contributed and done this work, So for example, an amazing book by Layla F. Saad, it's called Me and White Supremacy. And she created this book as a sort of handbook for white people to understand their racism, how they're racist, and how that plays out, So yeah, for me, that's been an incredible tool and way just to, hold white people accountable and actually be like, this is the work that you need to do, And so there's some conversations I won't engage with unless you've actually done this work.
That's a really, well, I really admire that line in the sand. Thank you. Geoff, what is the cost? And I see, and just to if anyone follows Geoff on Twitter, the work you do there is phenomenal. But yeah, how would you answer that? The cost to you and what you need, what we all need to support these conversations.
I think, education is useless if you keep it to yourself. The important thing is that we've got to try. It's not about influencing people. It's so they know the truth and they can make their own decisions. Mm. The point is that if people are ignorant for one reason or the other, they can make decisions based on that ignorance. And as long as that ignorance remains, we're going to have this problem. And therefore, what I've tried to do is if you look around this house here, at this table, it's full of books. I'll turn that around and you see nobody's used that dining table for 2 years because the books are that high. Because when I'm talking in Twitter, I'm now putting out in summary what I've read. And I want people to use that information. It's just the way I did in science. I had to research the science myself and then put out the information. And therefore, that's exactly what I'm trying to do with this history. Because I think when people know, they will behave better. And I think we should all do that. And I just feel that, what the Scottish government is saying is that, we are one Scotland. And I believe that, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I'm trying to use education as a weapon against people who would still try to put forward this awful view that we're different. We are something, which was made as a second thought. And therefore, I'm trying to ensure that our children will look at each other, as one, as I say, one humanity. I keep using that because that's what I believe we are. I really do. I'm convinced that there is nothing between us that you could use to say this person should suffer because of a pigment. And people have invented names, terms. You look up the dictionary. I want people to do that. And look up the word race and look at its meaning. If something doesn't have a definition, it's meaningless. The definition for race is clearer about running up and down, racing, than about people. It was made up. And therefore, it has taken me a lot of time to point that out. It's made up. It's man-made. So is the word species. They're man-made. And they've caused so much damage.
Yeah.
And people are listening. And we had the vote to show you why I do this, because we had the vote about the planning permission for the plaque. So we've agreed on the narrative that this man enslaved hundreds of thousands of people. But we need planning permission. And I looked at the voting, and it was Monday, we were ahead in terms of planning permission, then Tuesday and Friday, because it was a 7-day thing, where I was watching. And on Saturday, it was 800 each for both sides, not to give the planning permission and to give the plaque. Nothing about slavery on the plaque. People are going to stop that because they don't want that plaque up.
And it's, I think...
And in the end, we got 1,285 to 1,004. And I thought, why would you have to go through all that? Where people wanted to stop the truth with a vote. Okay, I'm a Democrat, but it tells us something still about the attitude to us. And I feel some sort of sense of victory that the majority did vote for the plaque to go up. And of course, the Viscount put up on Twitter some rather offensive comment about myself. But, I'm not really bothered about that. I think that when somebody is criticizing you like that, they lost the argument.
What about Lisa? And I think...
what I found very, very stressful over the last few months is people trying to drag me into really toxic conversations, which I'm trying to stay away from, because I do think we're at a stage now where there is a tendency to people trying to manufacture a culture war for another more sinister agenda. I'll say that, I think I see that. I think we have to watch very carefully about times when we might be being baited. I think we have to be careful. I mean, I've turned down quite a few media requests recently where people trying to get me to provide clickbait for them, and it wasn't in a constructive way. They didn't really want to hear nuances in any way. So I've had to sort of take care of myself in that kind of way. I do think that, what Thulani's saying as well about making sure that other people do some work and get educated before you get involved in a conversation, because it can be exhausting going back to the 101 all the time. I mean, really, it wastes a lot of time, and that can be annoying. But I also do understand when people do just feel a bit bewildered and, they don't realise they're asking a question that 500 people have also just asked you in the 2 weeks previously. They genuinely think they're one of the only people. You've had 500 maybe requests coming in right across platforms, and you're just like, where do I start with this? Maybe I will just do a reading list and right, here's your reading list, start with that. That can be helpful to them and to me and to us. And then I think what's important as well, if we really want to include young people, and particularly young people of colour, to educate, to get involved in heritage, things like that, make sure people are paid. Make sure they're paid for their labour. Make sure it's not an extra thing that they have to do on top of all the other gigs that young millennials are trying to, tussle to try and just get by, especially as a creative person. That's so important, because even now in this day and age, I don't mind so much for myself as an older person, but if there's a younger person constantly being asked to do things for free and at the last minute with no real respect, that's really stressful. And I think a lot of institutions who have money, they haven't put aside the budget for it, but I think they can find it if they need it. Obviously, we're in difficult times now with COVID and everything. But I think if you really respect someone's opinion and respect someone's work, you make sure pay them as much as you can do, or create some kind of creative way of paying them. And also make sure that you're creating long-term pathways, that it's not just a one-off thing because it's the new trend and people say, oh, it's very in right now, so let's be, so it becomes a trend. There will be some people who will regard it as a trend and they'll get swept up with the emotion of it and move on. Next year they're not really that bothered, but who knows what will happen. There will be some people who are really committing to doing this for the long term, and I think we can work with a lot more people who are committed to doing that. And I suppose it's finding those people who are really genuinely willing to listen and learn and do better and really be, some people call it an ally. I don't particularly like that word, but that's the whole other conversation. But genuinely want to work together. I mean, for a better future for all of us,
it feels, I'm conscious I want to get in one question before we have to go. We've got two quite meaty ones, and one I think we could that would be the perfect one to sum up what we're talking about and that was from Dean, who was asking, and this is part of the reading list one, which books would be a good entry level text to begin to understand Scotland's legacy of empire. So I'm gonna insist that you only recommend two or even just one, and then we'll try and get through and we'll have enough time to say goodbye properly. So I'll go for Geoff first. I'm going to go to you, Sir Geoff.
I don't really have a list. Really. I feel that at the moment we don't have a book that covers this history and covers it in a way that would be very sensible. There are lots of books, and they're difficult to negotiate. And I think, what I think has happened over the last, since George Floyd's death, I would advise go and look at the media, the various programs that have been made, say one like yours, if you put it out, then I would advise is to look at a lot of the programs that have been made since George Floyd's death. Look at the newspapers and try and somehow use one's own intelligence to try and work out what happened in the past, what is happening now, because a lot of information is out there. And the media has been extremely good at tracking this history and tracking what we're saying and tracking what, a large variety of people are saying from America, from especially America and the UK, but also in the Caribbean. And I think that's the best way to go about it, rather than, I'm very suspicious of books which try to labor a point. And therefore, we wouldn't have that in science. Science would have a book where you've got to go and check the references. And if the methodology isn't right, you can ignore the work. We don't have that in this area. The methodology can be dodgy or whatever, and people still accept it. So I would advise to look at what's been produced since George Floyd's death. And then you can pick other books which deals with these matters in detail. And look at Twitter, look at Facebook, because you can begin to know what to read and what not to be. And one of the most valuable things I've learned in terms of the media is that when people talk rubbish, it can tell you how some people think. Yeah. And that is very important.
Thank you. That's a good one. Look for the people who are talking rubbish and ignore
rubbish, them. Yeah. Because that tells you something of how people think.
Lisa. Well, obviously, I think we first would say is go on one of Lisa's tours. That would be a good first step.
You could do. You're very welcome to come along. I am working on some written stuff as well, but that won't be ready just yet. It's actually difficult because there is a serious gap. That's really Scotland specific. That's accessible, easy to get hold of. If people, it's not really an entry level as such, but it's for a popular audience. The Angela Saini book Superior, I think, is really good. So for people to understand how race is a social construct, but it's also a power construct, it's social construct with specific consequences and meanings for power and society. So when I work in schools, I suggest that sometimes so they can explain to young people that it's not that this idea of race has been around for forever. It is, you know, a relatively new thing. And I think people understand that it's easier to deconstruct it. Just to make it quick, I think the Akala book, Natives, Race and Class, is not Scotland specific. I think that's accessible. I've taken a lot of teachers on tours recently, state school, private school teachers, people you wouldn't think would be that interested. And I hear the younger teachers saying, "Have you read Akala's book?" And they're like, yeah, they've all read Akala's book, which I think is great. The other thing too, social media I'm a bit wary of, because I think people can be very clever about how they put certain ideas across, making it sound like it's reasonable. And when you dig or you know the facts, you know it's nonsense, but it can sound good at the time. I think we're in a wonderful position to have, like we're having now, transnational conversations. We've got the technology now. One of the few good things about this horrible virus is that we're able to connect in this way, and it's accessible for a lot more people for a lot of reasons. So I think if we can continue these conversations and chat to teachers in the Caribbean, link up young people who already do that anyway, but make certain avenues for these conversations to happen transnationally, it'll make it a lot quicker. Because they'll say, hang on, yeah, I know when Scots, you know, I've worked in primary schools in the Caribbean, and an 8-year-old can tell you about Sir Ralph Abercrombie easily, but you might not find that with an adult here. So, but they can fill you in on, you know, what they learn in the syllabus over there. And you could maybe do that with South Africa, you could do that with India, you could do that with a lot of different places and see how that connects with Scotland.
Well, thank you I think I've run out of time, which is awful, because Tulani, I can't get your reading.
Oh no, that's me, my fault.
But maybe if you can shout a book really quickly. No. Well, what I would suggest to everyone watching is a real first port of call is to find out more about Lisa, Thulani and Geoff's work, because that is a real step towards kind of considering these issues. And this has just been a wonderful conversation. I think we could go on for longer, but except that we can't. So I want to just say thank you so much to Wigtown for giving us this space to have this, what I think was a really warm and informative conversation. And I think we'd all say to everybody listening that you can do the work that's out there to find out. And I think it's about, this history is all of our history, and that we have to look at it with a clear eye and with a good heart, and realize that loving somewhere is like loving someone. You have to do it honestly, and that's where we can find change. So thank you so much to it's been an absolute joy to be with you for this now time that I'm not quite aware how long it has been, and thank you to Wigtown. And I don't know how. Yep. So I'll say goodbye. So goodbye everybody, and take care, and good wishes.
Thank you for an excellent job.
Thank you.
Bye everyone. Thank you.